So over the years, I've had the privilege of journeying with many people who were facing major surgery or other significant medical procedures. I've never, ever heard one of them say something like this. I really don't care whether this surgery works. I'll go through it, but I'm really not doing it with the intent or with the expectation or with the hope that it will do any good. Never heard that. After the treatment is over, and if it's major surgery, it's often on the second day after, right? What I've often heard is some version of this: boy, I sure hope I don't have to go through this pain for nothing. I sure hope this pain will be worth it in the long run. We all go through pain, some of which we know won't go away, and we often say we want to learn and grow through these things. But are we? Do we? Am I learning to cooperate with God's regime for processing and growing through pain, or am I wasting my pain? We'd like to say whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but we all know that's not true. At least not stronger in any kind of way we really want to be. We've all had people in our lives that have gone through painful experiences who are more bitter, more angry, harder to be with. And the reality is that suffering, pain, tends to make us more self-focused, doesn't it? Isn't that right? So can we agree on that and just put that on the table right now? Say to yourself, you don't have to say it out loud, but say to yourself, yes, my pain makes me more self-focused. Can you say that? It happens. That's what pain does. Until I come to terms with that fact, I'll never get past wasting my pain. The reality of suffering and the evil that seems to be behind it is, in many people's minds, the dominant challenge regarding Christian faith. Especially when it's suffering that we don't think is deserved. Why do bad things happen to innocent people? In the 18th century, philosopher David Hume summarized the question that's been around since philosophers began philosophizing. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not omnipotent. He's impotent, powerless. Is he able but not willing? Well, then he's malevolent. He's malicious. He's evil himself. Is he both able and willing? Then why is there evil? A number of years ago, a tsunami in the Indian Ocean killed over 250,000 people. Boom, just like that. A reporter on that event put the charge very succinctly. If God is God, he's not good. If God is good, he's not God. You can't have it both ways. That's how he put it. Have you ever felt that way? Maybe you haven't allowed yourself to put it in such stark black and white terms, but we have all been stalled, slowed down, or we've stumbled at least a bit because of some undeserved pain that we experience. The confusion and frustration of trying to figure out what is God doing has drained our energy, it's distracted our focus, it's put a wet blanket on our enthusiasm, and it's hampered our effectiveness in our faith life, hasn't it? We're coming back today in our journey through the book that is the first letter by the Apostle Peter. 2 more Sundays, today and next week. Today we're in chapter 4 of 1 Peter. One of the main reasons Peter is writing his book is because he wants to put it on the table, to be aware that we all experience suffering. And he wants to be sure that the significant suffering, the persecution that these followers of Jesus are experiencing will not turn them sour towards God, but will actually make them stronger. He first raises this suffering factor in chapter 1, verse 6. In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you've had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. Trials of all kinds. Basically the same way that Peter's close apostle buddy James begins his book, right? In James chapter 1, he says, "Consider it all joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds." Same word. It's a word that means variety of trials. So obviously it's not just Peter and John who have talked theology, or Peter and Paul. It's Peter and James. They've been talking about this. Now that raises something that we really need to spend a few minutes fleshing out just a bit. Let's zoom out and talk about the many different kinds of suffering and pain we experience. Several years ago, I sat down and tried to think through the various kinds of trials we experience. I'm sure there's not the whole picture, or maybe even the best picture, but it's a start. You may be able to add to this list, and you may even want to talk about this list. Number one, much of the pain we experience is a direct consequence of making poor choices, whether it's sin or whether it's just plain stupidity, right? The Bible has a word picture for this kind of pain. It's called sowing and reaping. You reap what you sow, and you reap more than you sow. That's the law of sowing and reaping. And that's what God's rules for living are all about. They're guardrails to help protect us from reaping what we sow kinds of suffering, right? It may be from a choice to violate God's pattern, or it may be simply carelessness, or maybe even wishful thinking. Sometimes we make decisions that are totally careless, stupid, or even sinful, and then when we experience the natural consequence of that decision, we wonder why God let it happen. If we're really going to learn and grow from it, the question we should be asking is not, why did God let it happen? It's, how can I keep myself from doing such a stupid thing again, right? How can I grow from it and not waste it? Sometimes we spiritualize it and we say, well, but I prayed about it and felt peace about it. Really? Or did I just pray so that I could say I prayed, all the while knowing what I would do? Something like, Lord, if I'm not supposed to do this, stop me. When I hear that prayer, I can just see God shaking his head and saying, I'm not a cosmic babysitter. Right? Sometimes we think we've done the right thing, and when we experience backlash, we think someone's out to get us. But it's not just a matter of doing the right thing. We can do the right thing, but for the wrong reason, and it won't be well received. People will see through it. We can do partially the right thing and a whole bunch of other wrong things with it. We can be sure we're doing the right thing, but it's actually the wrong thing, and the problem being that our perspective was very narrow, or even that we've been led. It's never quite as simple as just saying, well, I prayed about it, and right? Beyond the sow and reap stuff, there's also suffering that is a direct correction from God. There are times when, beyond the natural consequences of sin, God, in his firm but loving way, steps in it to try to get our attention and bring us back on course. He doesn't do it to be vindictive, but to be corrective. David experienced this kind of suffering in his personal moral failure with Bathsheba, right? God stepped in directly. David paid big time. In the end, David said, my suffering was good for me. It taught me to pay attention to your decrees. But those aren't the only kinds of suffering. These we can understand. We can understand them partially because we can see a direct cause and effect relationship. We liked direct cause and effect relationships because in our thinking, at least, we can deal with it and get on with life. But much of the suffering we face is simply a result of living in a fallen world. Suffering is the human condition. We might call it, well, that's just life kinds of suffering. Sin entered the world through the choice of the first human beings God created, and because of that choice, sin and death entered the picture, and suffering becomes the human condition. It's not that every situation of suffering has a direct correlation to some act of sin. Jesus said that in John 9, I think it is, right? But everyone is affected by the sin of our first parents. It just is. Job, his conclusion was, mortals born of women are a few days and full of trouble. That's just it. Moses, during the 40 years of wilderness wandering, wrote Psalm 90 as a prayer. And here's how he begins. Our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures, yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. A job loss due to cutbacks, a major accident, cancer, an earthquake that kills hundreds and leaves thousands more homeless. That kind of suffering has been around since sin entered the world, although it may not be directly tied to an act of sin. What's the first recorded incident of this kind of suffering? It was an Adam and Eve's son, right? Cain killing his brother Abel. Did Abel deserve what he got? No, he was the good one. Did God engineer the death of Abel and the rebellion of Cain to keep rubbing it into Eve? No. He was not trying to get the message through to them, you're sinners, you're trash, and I'll keep reminding you of that. In a fallen world, there will be suffering. By the way, do you see how just recognizing that gives us one resource to help us understand our own feelings? What is it we say? We say, it's not fair. But that's not really what we're feeling underneath. What we're really feeling is that pain and suffering is not what we were created to live in. In every human being, because we're made as God's image, is what I call an echo of Eden. We know inside of us that pain is not what we were created for, but it is what we inherited. But when we take that and make it a fairness issue, we're leaving a whole chunk out of the picture because we live in a fallen world, pain is. And when we make it a fairness issue, it keeps us from not wasting our pain. Sometimes we waste mental energy looking for a reason we're suffering, the reason someone is suffering. Now, in our looking for a reason, which direction are we looking? We're looking backward. Why did this happen? As long as we're looking backward, we'll be stuck in the ditch. There's another way to ask that why question. It's looking forward. How can I make this meaningful and not waste it? That's what Peter is inviting us to do in our text for today. But for now, let's finish our survey regarding the kinds of suffering we experience. There's another kind that some of us experience that's technically under the category we just talked about. But it has some of its own unique complicating factors, and I think we need to list it separately. Because we live in a fallen world, and because the nature of our creation as humans, created as God's image, with a capacity to think and reason and live by choices rather than simply instinct and conditioning, one of the toughest kinds of suffering is mental illness and emotional conditions that are the result of our genetic makeup. Our brains wired wrong from birth, or some other kind of psychological dysfunction. And sometimes, because of our mixed up brains, we do things that bring even more suffering on ourselves. And some of us pray that God will remove it and will heal us. And sometimes He might, and sometimes we believe He has, but then the cycle happens again, and it's devastating, right? It's often the kind of suffering that we have to cope with all of our lives. There's another kind of category in suffering. Suffering that is a direct attack from Satan. Now, we often flee to this category immediately, possibly too quickly, giving Satan a lot more press than he deserves, but it does happen. We know that Satan had direct access to Jesus when he was on earth, Matthew chapter 4, and Paul calls at least one aspect of his suffering experience, 2 Corinthians 12, he calls it a messenger of Satan. But here's the deal with this kind of suffering. Who is it the evil one's attacking? It's not me. It's God. It's an attack on God, on His name, His reputation. It's not our battle to fight. We're going to talk more about that next week from chapter 5. And then Hebrews chapter 12 talks about another kind of suffering. It's pain experiences that are simply sent from God to condition us. It refers in Hebrews 12 to discipline from God that He gives. And it's not discipline in the sense of punishment or correction. It's discipline in the sense of working out discipline. He uses terminology that we use in the athletic world when we talk about strength conditioning. The strengthening of muscles involves suffering. The breakdown of tissues, which involves pain. And spiritual strength, just like physical strength, requires some pain. Now here's the beautiful thing about God. If we process any pain well, all of it can move into this category. One more category, but let's take a look at the list up to this point. All of these kinds of suffering have one thing in common. What is it? They are all, to some extent, involuntary. We don't choose them. Some of them we bring on, but we don't directly choose them. They find us. But to complete the list, it's important to recognize another kind of suffering that's actually voluntary. Who in the world would choose suffering? Well, anytime you choose to sacrifice for others, to serve others, if you do it in the right spirit, you're actually choosing to suffer. To let go of your own agenda, to give up something. Those of us who are parents get this very well. To have a child is to choose, in many ways, to give up your own life for the sake of others. And to start making choices that are sacrificial. Is there a reward? It's not guaranteed. Some of us who are grandparents, when our children share with us their struggles, inside we smile, and our inside voice is saying, yep, grandchildren really are God's reward for not killing your own children. There really is some justice. Okay? But it's a sacrifice we choose. That's what serving God is all about. It's about making sacrifices for Jesus' sake. And our lives, our church, has stories of people who have done that, are doing that for the sake of the kingdom. By the way, after church or sometime this week, why don't you affirm somebody that you see them doing this? You recognize it. Now, one of the really important aspects of pain, dealing with pain, is coming to terms with which kind of pain it really is. But with that as a background, let's look at 1 Peter 4. Peter has talked about suffering in general terms. It's been a thread throughout the book, but it's in chapter 4 that he addresses it very specifically. And what we get is not a philosophical answer to suffering. What we get is something way more powerful and a lot more practical. What we get is some clear teaching on how to grow through suffering, how I can make sure my pain is going to have positive results, how I can move from letting pain define me and use it to refine me into a person that's healthy and strong, not just in spite of it, but through it. Chapter 4, Peter lays out 3 ways that we can use suffering, undeserved suffering, to refine us, to grow us, to strengthen it. First one is in verses 1 to 6. And let's just read chapter 4 of 1 Peter, verses 1 to 6. Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. They're surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. But they'll have to give account to him who's ready to judge the living and the dead. For this reason, the gospel was preached even to those who are now dead, so that they might be judged according to human standards in regard to the body, but live according to God in regard to the Spirit. Now that's got some a little bit convoluted kind of stuff in it as we first look at it, but what's his main point? He's talking about the starting point for making suffering meaningful and allowing suffering to produce growth. What is it? It's to use suffering to refine our focus, to redefine our purpose, to reshape our desires. And the only way we can do that is to allow our experience of suffering to follow Jesus. I think we've got to move one slide back there. Sorry. I'm wrong. Follow Jesus in making God's will, God's desires for me. Actually, I think one more ahead. I'm sorry. follow Jesus in making God's will, God's desires for me more important than my will and my desires for myself. That's what he's saying. Can you see his main point? Let's try to follow his logic. Look at those verses and let's try and follow his logic through them. Jesus, he says, chose to suffer for you in accordance with God's will because he was committed to the will of God, and for him, God's will involves suffering. As Peter's writing this, I think there are two encounters he had with Jesus that must have been on the forefront of his mind. When Jesus first began to tell his disciples that his mission involved death, Peter immediately discovered his own mission. He was going to make sure that didn't happen. Remember that? Don't worry, man, that's why we're here. Not on our watch. And what did Jesus say to Peter? Matthew 16. Get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. Peter struggled with God's will for Jesus and Peter's will for Jesus right to the day of his death. The night of his death, Peter heard Jesus pray to God, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but as you will. I'm committed to what you want, even if it goes against what I desperately want. Peter had heard Jesus pray that, but he can't get over what he wants for Jesus. Peter's not thinking of Jesus, he's thinking about himself because of what he thinks God will for Jesus might mean for himself. He's going to become a co-leader with Jesus over everybody. And so even after he heard Jesus say this to God, when they came to get Jesus, Peter takes out his sword and he swings it and he cuts off the ear of one of those who came to get Jesus. He's still in this not on my watch mentality, right? And what does Jesus say to Peter? Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? We so struggle with God's will for us because of what we want God's will for us to be, right? We want it to promote us, make us feel good and look good, when God's will is to refine us. But when the Holy Spirit came on him, that was the biggest change in Peter's heart, his deep thinking. He comes to the same point as Paul, who had his own fight with God's will versus his will, right? And yet when Paul really gets Jesus, he comes to see that God's will is, well, Romans 12:2, really good. It's pleasing. It's perfect because he's come to see that Jesus' suffering is God's way of bringing us to him. The very first question I need to ask myself when I'm going to go through pain, get stronger in pain, is have I come to truly believe that God's will is good, pleasing, and perfect, even if it goes against my will and my thinking? Second part to Peter's thinking is that Jesus suffered for me to bring me to God. And so what does that mean for me to follow Jesus? Well, Peter puts it in an interesting way. He says, arm yourselves with the same kind of thinking as Jesus. Arm yourselves. This is a spiritual warfare term. It's both a defensive and an offensive weapon. He's talking about our thinking process. Several weeks ago, I was doing an internet search for something. I forget what it was, and I typed in the word worship. And I looked at results I got, and I thought, what? And then I looked at my search line, and I saw that my always helpful assistant did an auto-correct for me and put in warship. I thought to myself, well, actually, that's not too far off. Because a key piece of true worship is equipping our minds for the spiritual battle of thinking well about God and life. As we worship, if we do it the way God intended, we're doing exactly what Peter is telling us to do, arming our thinking, our deep thinking of patterns, and aligning it with the truth about God's word and God's will. Peter says, arm yourself also with the same attitude, or the English Standard Version has it a bit better, the same way of thinking. This is the same word as in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12, where it says, the word of God is alive and active, sharper than any two-edged sword. It judges and exposes the thoughts and intents, the intentions of the heart. What Peter's saying is that looking at Jesus, following Jesus, means arming ourselves with the same intention, the same purpose, the same direction in our thinking, which is, I will choose to make God's will trump my desires. Every time. So, number one, Jesus chose to suffer to bring me to God. I will choose to respond like Jesus did and make God's will my priority in suffering. And then the third thing he says, because he or whoever suffers in the body, in the flesh, is done with sin. So what does that mean? We never sin again? No. I like the way Wayne Grudem puts it. He says something like this: whoever has suffered for doing right, like Jesus, who suffered and has kept on obeying God, putting his will above mine, has made a clear break from a sinful way of thinking. Because what is sin? It's doing what is counter to the will of God. Suffering well is the path to breaking ourselves from the sin habit. Can you see how Peter's saying that? God's will for Jesus involved suffering. Jesus processed suffering. He was able to endure and persevere through the ultimate suffering by arming himself, channeling his thinking towards God's will for me trumps my desires for me. That's always the first step to making sure our pain is not wasted. Now let's look at some of the details in verses 3 to 6 and how they flesh out this point. Again, verses 3 to 6 it's not really transparent necessarily. He says, for you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. They are surprised when you do not join them in their reckless wild living, and they heap abuse on you. But they'll have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this reason, the gospel was preached even to those who are now dead, so that they might be judged according to human standards and live in regard to the body, but live with God in regard to the spirit. So how in the world does that relate to his main point? Well, it speaks to two ways. We need to arm ourselves with Jesus' way of thinking and how that corrects our thinking. You see, it's easy to think of suffering in terms of God judging us, right? God must be judging me. And we live this defeated, low-level guilt and keep beating ourselves up. I must deserve this. A number of years ago, I went through an experience of, well, as one friend put it to me, he said, Mel, it seems like God's pulling you through a knothole backwards. Another friend who was a bit more of a skeptic, and I think looking for a way to not give himself to following God fully, he said to me, well, Mel, the way I see it, God had to be really mad at you. You did nothing wrong that I can see, but boy, did he give it to you. Peter's saying, well, it certainly is true that there will be coming a day of accountability before God. But, if you have accepted Jesus as the one who has taken all the judgment you deserve on himself, my suffering is never a judgment of God on me. The judgment factor is dealt with. Folks, some of us need to hear that this morning. No, God is not judging you. If you have accepted Jesus as the one whom God has judged in your place and the one who calls you to follow him, God is not judging you. He may be helping to correct you. He may not be keeping you from the consequences of what you've done, but God is not judging you. His judgment on you has fallen on Jesus. Now again, there's sort of two ditches in everything. The one ditch is God is judging me. But some of us are in the other ditch saying, no, God's not judging me, period. Hold it. Are you listening to his correcting of you? Shaping of you? Refining you? Are you cooperating with him in that? That's what verse 6 is all about when he says, so that they might not be judged according to human standards in regard to body, but live according to God regarding the Spirit. To live by the Spirit is to be controlled by the Spirit, led by, in the power of the Spirit, and not give up letting God refine us. Check out Romans chapter 8. I think what he's saying in verse 6, for this reason the gospel is preached even to those who are now dead. In other words, people who have died and have received Jesus, their death wasn't a judgment of God on them. They're alive in the power of the Spirit. And when I remove the judgment thing, what can happen is I can then begin to see ways that God might be allowing this to develop me, to strengthen me, to focus me, to grow me, to purify me. There's a second excuse that we use when it comes to God and suffering that keeps us from making God's will more important than my will. Sometimes suffering makes us doubt whether there really is a God. Where is God when I suffer? What is that at the heart of it? It's a justice question, right? Well, it's the suffering of Jesus that answers that as well. It's a wonderful book by a professor by the name of David Skeel. It's called True Paradox: How Christianity Makes Sense of Our Complex World. It's not really a complicated book, but it addresses some complicated issues. Wonderful book. He puts it this way: pain and suffering are still ugly, but Jesus, having suffered, puts the ordeal of suffering in a different light. When skeptics of Christianity point to the problem of evil, they usually suggest that if suffering exists, there cannot be a good God. But their reasoning implies that if God does exist, he should be punished for permitting this suffering. Christians certainly do not believe that God deserves to be punished, but he was. God did not simply allow suffering and walk away from it. Jesus took this responsibility on himself and died on our behalf. Tim Keller, in his book Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, puts it this way: we do not know the reason God allows evil and suffering to continue or why it is so random, but now, when we see the cross of Jesus, at least we know what the reason is not. It cannot be that God does not love us. It cannot be that God does not care. Jesus did not come to earth the first time to bring justice, but to bear it on himself. He came not with a sword in his hands, but with nails through his hands. Friends, some of us have allowed our growth to be stunting, our attitudes to be jaded, our perspectives to be distorted. We've allowed barriers to be erected in our minds because we think we're not getting what we deserve. It's not fair. We're getting the short end of the stick in every way, and we're fighting it. We're giving up on growth because of it. We're keeping people at bay because of it. Some of us need to look ourselves in the mirror and say lovingly, your attitude sucks, to ourselves, because I'm making about my will and not God's will. And then we need to arm ourselves, pick up the armor of a vertical edge reality that Peter's talking about, and say, okay, God, I want to do your will, even if it involves suffering, even if it involves not getting in my way, because you have already dealt with any judgment on me. So, number one, make God's will more important than my will. And then picking up on what he's already said in chapter 3, we looked at it way back in December, because Peter says it again, we'll say it again. Number 2, live with the end in mind. Live, even in your suffering, not looking at your suffering, but looking at the other side. Peter begins his next instruction by saying, verse 7, the end of all things is near. He's not doing an about face here and saying, you better get ready, better get your act together because judgment is coming. Now, that's certainly a valid point, but that's not what he's saying here. He's saying, listen, this life you are living now is not going to be permanent, regardless of how it feels. when forever is in view, now is just such a short time. And as his apostle buddy John puts it in the book of Revelation, the time is coming when every tear will be wiped dry. There will be no mourning, there will be no crying, there will be no pain. It will all be wiped away. To complete what Jesus did in bearing your unjust suffering or your just suffering on himself, Jesus himself will come and draw you into his perfection and beauty and glory forever. For now, it takes discipline, but that is what I've given the Holy Spirit for, to be able to see that end and live from it. How do I know I'm living with the end in mind? How will it show that I'm living with the end in mind? 3 things, Peter says. I will, number 1, look up and pray well. Verse 7, the end of all things is near. Therefore, be clear-minded and self-controlled so that you can pray. Don't let suffering turn you inward. Keep on looking to and engaging the God who suffered for you. Pray well and pray more. We will pray, as Jesus says, in our closet alone, and we will pray when we're together. How often in the course of conversation as you're visiting someone do you say, let's just pray? One of my favorite prayers was a man by the name of Abe. Older man, he was a retired railway engineer, and he just loved God. When I was a young pastor, he took it on his mission to get me out of the office, and one day he took me out fishing in his little canoe to Zippermouth Lake. We had to do some portaging to get there, cross a big lake and portage and get to this little lake. A wonderful day together. I'll never forget that day. We canoed. Yeah, we had our lines in the water. But most of the day we just spent talking. And as we're talking, every once in a while, just keep on talking. I realized, oh no, he's not talking to me. He's talking to Jesus. And then he'd start talking to me again. And all of a sudden, he'd just talk to Jesus. Never forget that day. As if Jesus was part of the conversation. Look up and pray well. Let's just think about the way we often think about praying. Don't we think about it in me-centered, feeling-centered ways? Have you ever said something like this? I haven't been praying much lately because I haven't felt close to God. Isn't that reversed? We think that to pray dynamically, we have to feel close to God. That's such a shallow view of prayer, and it's a reversed view of prayer. True prayer comes by God-activated and God-armed thinking. We don't pray because we've allowed our minds to be clouded by wrong priorities and now-centered feelings. We don't begin praying by having a new feeling for God. We begin praying by choosing to think right about God and bringing ourselves underneath Him and recognizing we are in Him. We begin praying when we call our minds to realize that Jesus has come near, or God has come near to me in Jesus Christ, and He invites me to come near to Him through Jesus Christ, whether I feel it or not. When Peter says, be clear-minded and self-controlled so that you can pray, he's saying, call to your minds the things that God has done and will do. Call to your mind who He is and what He has promised, and simply respond to Him in light of that. Live in light of God's active, sovereign, and loving presence, not in reaction to the pressure or the pain. Look up and pray more. And then, verses 8 and 9, look out and love well. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Praying well will always drive you from looking inward to looking to others. You can't understand this paragraph without understanding that Peter is talking about how to handle your personal pain in light of God's grace. We don't do these things once the suffering is over. We do these things so that we can process our suffering well. What aspect of love is Peter most concerned about? Hospitality. Letting others in to your space. Show hospitality to one another without complaining. So many times we use pain as an excuse to not focusing on others, to include others. How many of your neighbors think of your home as the place to be? Do you know the secret to the growth of the early church? In an environment that was hostile to Christian faith, the kind of environment that Peter was talking about, it wasn't big events. It wasn't Hughes preaching things and healing. It's right here. It was hospitality. Rodney Stark, a sociologist who's written a book called The Rise of Christianity, in his research, he says that the growth of the early church happened because ordinary people opened their homes to everyone and shared what they had, their food, which was scarce, their possessions, which were sparse, and the love of Jesus, which was full and abundant and overflowing. Look out and love well. And number 3, look around and serve well. Maximize whatever gifts I have by giving it in service to others. Verse 10, each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. If anyone speaks, they should do so as one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with the strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To Him be the glory and power forever and ever. Now, let me just get it out there. The question here is not, what is my gift? Nowhere in the Bible are we told to discover our gifts. That's self-centered thinking. We're told to use what we have to serve. Your gift is what you have, okay? Use what you have to serve to minister God's grace. When we focus on our gifts and our fulfillment through using our gifts, we're totally missing the point. I read an article once in Leadership Journal that talked about our tendency to love our own gift wrongly. When we do that, instead of shining like, they use the analogy, and he's talking about focusing on our gift. And when we do that, it said, instead of shining like stars in the universe, which Paul says in Philippians we'll do, we actually become black holes in the universe. What's a black hole? It's a place in space where gravity pulls so much that even light can't get out. A star has turned inward to the point that it ceases to shine. This happens, it says in this article, when too much matter is squeezed into too little space. No. Look around and serve well. It begins by simply connecting with someone you don't know. Those are the things that show you're living from the end, even when suffering tends to pull you into yourself and into the now. How's God calling you to turn out? Look out. Perhaps you need to invite someone to help you do these 3 things. If you have the courage, you need to offer someone to help with these 3 things. I was thinking this week, I had when I was a chaplain to a junior hockey team, the manager, who didn't really have much use for things of God, but he, wanted to appear buddy-buddy with me. He would go sometimes before a game, he'd say, Mel, you got to pray for us. I'd say, buddy, my job's not to pray for you. My job's to teach you to pray. He only asked that 3 times. Yeah. Share what you have and help others. Peter finishes the chapter by showing us one more way we can allow suffering to refine us, to strengthen us, to grow us. Verse 12, dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that's come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you, but rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you're insulted because of the name of Christ, you're blessed, for the Spirit of glory and God rests on you. If you suffer, it should not be as a murderer or thief or any other kind of criminal or even as a meddler. However, if you suffer as a Christ follower, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name. For it's time for judgment to begin with God's household. And if it begins with us, that will be what will be the outcome of those who do not obey the gospel. And if it's hard for the righteous to be saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? So then, those who suffer according to God's will should commit themselves to their faithful Creator and simply continue to do good. We don't have time to unpack all of that. Let me just highlight Peter's main point in this paragraph, what I think it's telling us. Don't let suffering surprise you, confuse you, distort your perspective, and stall your growth, but rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ so that you may be overjoyed when His glory is revealed. Now, when you look at that, note, he doesn't say you're suffering like Jesus suffered. He says you are participating in suffering with Jesus. You know how most of us accept suffering even when we think it's an opportunity for growth? We accept it by asking the question, what's the lesson I need to learn here? And we think we're being righteous. We try to think of the lesson God might be teaching us. Why? So that we can get past the suffering and on to something good again, right? Let me learn a lesson, get over with it. Now, does God teach us through suffering? Yes, He does. But Peter is inviting us into something way more powerful than simply learning a lesson. I think Peter's saying, will you let your pain move you beyond just wanting to learn a lesson and get past it, to letting that pain draw you into deeper participation, deeper union with Jesus? That is when suffering does its perfect work. Several years ago, Donna had been processing a costly decision we have made. Through some suffering, we wanted to make it meaningful, and we made a choice to serve. And there were many ways it didn't work out for us. Cost us. And she said to me, if you knew now what you didn't know then, would you do it again? I said, wow. I don't know how to answer that question. I said, how about you? I said, obviously you've been thinking about it. She said, yeah, I would choose to do it again. Because I wouldn't want to be the person I would have become. She had learned to grow deeper with Jesus and to let suffering refine her.